go through all the form, or the paper, and see what was in there. I did go to a station one time when I said, I need to see your public file, and he pulled out a drawer, and it was just piles of paper in there. I said, what is this? He said, that's my public file. But there was no folders or nothing, so I had to rummage through all that stuff. I found all the stuff. He had all the stuff there. It just wasn't in the nice order that we would like to see it. About the only other thing that you typically look at nowadays, since you don't have to look at the public file at the studio, is EAS, and make sure that that's working and the logs are working. Of course, that's the Sage. We had a Sage sitting over here, but I let some station use it because theirs got hit by lightning. So he just called me yesterday. He said he got his back. So, but that's the Sage unit, and then some of you have DASDEC units. The DASDEC unit is actually a computer. Those of you who have DASDECs, that's a computer, and it's got the audio inputs on the back are actually an audio card, and you have to break out for the different monitors. The Sage, that's just like their old one. They're both running Linux. This one actually has that's a computer, and the Sage is running Linux too, but it's running on the kernel. It doesn't have any hard drive or anything. What you want to look at, and what you have to look at as an inspector when you come in, the FCC rules are pretty simple on what you have to do. One is you have to receive a required weekly test from both the assigned monitor sources along with the required weekly test that's issued through the IPAWS system. Now, the required monitor system, the monitor sources are typically assigned to you by the state EAS committee, or the SECC they call it now, State Emergency Communications Committee. That's not to say that you're locked into that or shouldn't be. If they assign you a particular station or two stations, and there's one that you're having trouble picking up, then we can assign you a different one. The way we do it in Alabama, we have it set up so we have several monitor sources or several LP1s and LP2s in each area, and we typically just list those on our EAS plan. No. They have actually installed a really nice VSAT satellite system, but they told him not to hook it up. So who knows? But that's the government. But that's the primary. You got to receive a weekly test from both your assigned sources and from IPAWS. IPAWS comes down, as you know, at 11 o'clock every Monday for each time zone. When they first started this, when FEMA started running those tests, they were going to send it down for each time zone. Well, I had that DASDEC and the Sage unit on my workbench, and I said, well, you know what, they had sent out an email, Al Kenyon with FEMA had sent an email out that said, we're going to start the test at 11 o'clock on Monday. So I said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to open up the FIPS codes so I can see all the time zones to just curiosity's sake, just to see them all come down. Well, all of a sudden, like on Sunday, I had it at the house on my workbench, and on Sunday, the thing went off, an alarm. I said, what the heck is that? And I go in there, and it's an IPAWS test. I said, man, they haven't even started, and they've messed this up. They're doing it on Sunday. Well, I happened to look at the FIPS code, and it was for Guam. I said, it's already Monday in Guam, duh, So it's working pretty good. We did notice last night, I don't know if any of you have yours hooked up, you get warnings or anything, but there was, what time was that last night? Around 9 o'clock or so?
9:30 or 9:50, I think it was.
People were getting reports that you could not poll, IPAWS server was down, and it was across the country. And everybody thought maybe FEMA had lost something and the server wasn't working. And then we found out that it was sort of isolated around the country. It wasn't just in one particular area. So we thought it was an internet problem. But I finally saw an email this morning from Harold Price with Sage, and they found out that Google DNS server messed up. And for some reason, it wouldn't replicate apps.fema.gov to an IP address. And a lot of stations rather than using their own ISP DNS number, they put 8.8.8.8, and Google went down. Their DNS server went down for, I think it was hour. You said it came back up an hour and a half or something.
It was about an hour and a half, 2 hours
Yeah,
that it was actually down.
But the people that only had the Google DNS IP in there, they lost connection to the IPAWS server. So that was one of those weird things. But that comes down every Monday at 11 o'clock. And that has to be actually set up. And we'll show you an actual log here in just a second.
One thing, if I may mention,
Yeah.
Larry was talking about the LP1 and 2. Some states, for example, like South Carolina, we have an LP1 and 2 network of commercial stations, and then we have a second backbone, which is our state educational radio network that provides backup. If a station changes their LP1 or 2, they have to have permission from the SECC chair, which would be Larry in this state, myself in South Carolina. And that becomes part of the station license. That information is turned over to the Federal Communications Commission. So if you inspect a station and they're not monitoring the correct stations according to the state plan, then there should be a document that is associated with their station license, even though it comes from the local inspector, showing what stations you had permission to monitor. Mm-hmm. And a copy of that is with the commission. So you want to look for that if you find something out of the ordinary and they're not monitoring the LP1 and LP2 appropriately that's been set up for.
Yeah, we actually issue a document to the station if they want to change monitor sources from what they were assigned. We actually, speaking of the network and all, we have 2 statewide networks in Alabama. Alabama Public Television, Wendell and his crews back there. Their master control is here in Birmingham, and they have 9 transmitters scattered around the state. And they're our primary statewide relay network. And we require everybody to monitor, as monitor source 1, Alabama Public Television, the nearest transmitter that they can pick up. We also have our own satellite network in the state using global security systems that Paul used to work with. We have 32 or 33 downlinks, something like that. Uses KU band on the SES1, I think it is, but that's our secondary feed. And then we also have a third feed, which is Alabama Public Radio. They have 4 full power stations from Tennessee down to Florida. So that's how we deliver it. And then we have LP1s and LP2s feeding off of those. So we try to have a really redundant distribution system. It's exciting to me when I go in to inspect the station and I look at their EAS log to see that they got a monthly test from 4 different sources. The chances of all 4 being down at one time is pretty slim, so that works out really well. IPAWS, in case you don't know, is the Integrated Public Alert Warning System. It's actually operated by FEMA. The CAP format, which is what IPAWS uses, the digital format, doesn't replace EAS. It's just a distribution method primarily designed for a presidential alert to send down. But FEMA saw, since we don't issue, we haven't ever issued a presidential alert, that service just sits there idle most of the time, except on Mondays when they run the test. So now they've opened up the use of that to state agencies, and we have authority here in Alabama when we send a monthly test or an Amber Alert or anything statewide. We not only push it out on our satellite network, we push it out through IPAWS, and it comes back down on the IPAWS channel, and you can do that. You have to fill out paperwork and promise them your firstborn and all this other kind of stuff. You know how the government is, but that's what IPAWS is. But you need to make sure that they're receiving the test from those. You also are required to transmit your own weekly test on all stations and all secondary audio and video streams. If you're running HD radio, you got to feed it out on that. If you're a TV station and you're running a .2 or .3 or .4, whatever, you have to feed that information out on that as well. One thing I'll mention on this, which doesn't really have anything to do with inspections, but just as general knowledge, one of the great things when, back before CAP, before we went digital, and everything was just legacy EAS, if, for instance, if a Amber Alert was issued, the only thing a television station crawl would say, a child abduction emergency has occurred. If the viewer was hearing impaired, they couldn't hear who the child was or where the problem was. All it said was child abduction. Well, when CAP was introduced, it said the great thing about it, television stations will have the ability to display the crawl of the entire message, which I said, hey, that's really great for television because they can show entire information. Well, the first time we ran some tests, it was still coming out legacy. We couldn't quite figure it out. And as you all know, when you set your units up, whether it's a DASDEC or a SAGE or whatever it is, it's a polling rate. Every 30 seconds, your box will actually poll the servers, that's secure servers, wherever they happen to be. Al won't tell us where they are, but they're hidden in a mountain somewhere, I guess. But they poll that every 30 seconds. And what we discovered was that's the polling problem is if your box polled and 2 seconds later there was an Amber Alert issued, you wouldn't poll again for 28 seconds. Within that 28-second time, you would get it from a legacy EAS. And so you would get it in legacy EAS so it doesn't do it. So we thought we would be brilliant and try to figure out a way to make that work, but we never could figure it out. And last year, I guess it was, when FEMA did their national test in September, they ran it in dual language, in English and Spanish. And the way that a station discovered how they wanted to get it was you can select it in the SAGE and the DASDEC, and there's a embedded URL in the header of the CAP. One points to a server URL that had the English version, and one pointed to a URL that had the Spanish version. Well, the Spanish stations were still getting it in English, but it all turned out to be that polling rate. Now, SAGE and DASDEC have come up with a remedy for that, and there's supposed to be a firmware coming up. I don't know if you've been reading any about that, but what they have done is they have developed a system so that when an alert comes in, it will automatically dump that polling rate and automatically poll. So you'll get it immediately. So that will eliminate that. That has nothing to do with inspections. I just thought, no extra cost for that. Yeah.
I've been out on inspections, and the crawl has sometimes been covered by closed captioning. And I've discussed with the stations that maybe they should put a flag up to cut programming, and then have the crawl go across it so that they don't have that problem.
Have you run into that?
I haven't run into that, but now let me add, I've run into confusion where the EAS information was covered by cable TV and not the local station, and that caused some issues. I'm sorry, I forgot to put my mic on. But where the conflict came from cable television versus the local station, but I haven't had an issue.
This was on, the one time I found it was on Bounce. That was adjacent, for the third adjacent on a terrestrial. And it was off air, and they put the closed captioning, which came from the network, at the top. And that's where the crawl was going by default, and it was covered. And I suggested that they could try to put the crawl at the bottom, but they said if there was more than one person talking, then the closed captioning would be at the bottom for the two people talking.
Really?
So the only thing I could suggest was to put a flag up of their station, cut programming completely, and put the crawl on during that. And some of them wouldn't do that because it could be during commercial.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I don't know about that because I haven't run into anything like that. I know all the crawls that I have seen always run at the bottom of the screen. And
You can move those with
yeah,
the
you
character
can-
generator. You can
right.
move them where you want them.
yeah, you can move them around, but typically it's all at the bottom of the screen.
But, and it depends, because they'll run the EAS, and they'll do it simultaneously for all three of the co-adjacent channels. And the main channel, it might be in the middle, and the second channel might be at the bottom. You know, so that every channel might be the closed captioning at different places, so it's gonna cover somewhere.
Yeah, well, they got separate character generators, I guess. You have got separate character generators for y'all's, Wendell, for each stream?
It's all handled through the automation system, so.
But it's sort of a separate character generator for each one though, isn't it? Although it's embedded in the automation.
It's just, you talking about when the EAS runs?
Yeah,
Uh,
where you place it?
Can you place it on
It's
a?
all at the very top of the screen when we run it on all 4 channels.
Oh, okay, I guess it does.
I don't know. Honestly, I haven't run into that. So.
Yeah.
We,
One of the things.
we have, we don't have like discrete character generators, but the character generation for the crawl is built in the switcher card. So I think the switcher card ought to be able to move it separately.
Yeah, I think you can move them,
Yeah.
just about in all of them, they can be moved. The one thing about this, remember that it really needs to be according to the rules at random dates and random times. I see a lot of people that's run them, we're gonna run it every Sunday morning at 2 a.m., you know, whatever. But it's actually supposed to, by the letter of the law, it actually says random dates and random times. So,
And I've had stations, almost every station, I know they're supposed to create their own weekly test from their station. And I said, how do you know your EAS is working? You know, just because you receive the test,
right,
doesn't mean it's gonna send one. I mean, it'll send one that you received,
yeah.
but how do you know that it's going to send one you create?
Mm-hmm.
And almost every one of them doesn't know they're supposed to create one.
Really?
Yeah,
Yeah, that's been a rule for
I know it has.
since
Yeah.
since ever. So you're
Well,
supposed to do
that's
that.
the one good thing
But
about.
but it's always been in Indiana, and I just took over for the guy that passed away. So I don't know why they're not doing it.
That's interesting because most recommendations is we tell people, and I think most people do it now, set the box in automatic, and it'll send the test automatically. It'll receive them and it'll log everything, and then it also does it random. So both Sage and DASDAC do that.
And that may be what it's doing, and they just aren't aware that it's doing that.
Well, that would come.
Doing that.
That's easy to look at if they're checking
That's
their
the-
logs properly. They're looking at it come
I
at a
haven't
different
seen
time.
anything that shows we're sending.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we'll he's got a log
Yeah, I
over
got
here.
a log.
We'll show you just a minute. That's something you really need to see.
Yeah.
So you got to receive a weekly test. Yeah,
I was
question.
gonna ask you, if, say for example, you got a weekly test, and some stations have problems with people not wanting to run the weekly test because it's gonna interrupt the programming.
10 seconds.
But if you get a weather alert that goes out over the system, can you count that as your weekly test?
No.
No.
Can't do it. Okay, I was told you could, that's.
No,
No,
the,
that's-
the weather service is not required.
Right. Yeah, if you're receiving, if that's a misnomer too, if you're receiving an activation from an LP1 or LP2, that can count as the weekly because it's an actual test
that's
coming
National
in,
Weather
yeah,
Service.
but not the National Weather Service.
Yeah.
Well, you know, we get about like monthly tests. Tornado.
Monthly is, but that didn't come
Yeah.
from National Weather Service
We'll
either.
get tornado warnings from our primaries, you know, and I
Yeah.
was wondering if one of those came across, can you count that as a weekly test?
It would have to come from the LP1 or LP2 that you're required to
That was
monitor.
my question.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that would be-
whatever. For the one that this one here, where you're receiving.
Right.
Yeah, where you're receiving.
The station always generates the local test. Each broadcast station and cable system and satellite radio, for example. And then on the reception, it's always from the LP1 and 2 are the two stations that you're monitoring.
Just one more dumb question. If you
Sure.
fail to get a test, a weekly test from one of your primaries for whatever reason, I would assume you note it and date it in the log, but are you required to do anything further than that?
Yes, you're required to contact that station and find out
That's what I
why.
thought.
Well,
Yeah.
the first thing, check your equipment to make sure your equipment's working.
Yeah,
And then if it's working, then contact the originating station to see if their announcer went to sleep at the wheel or whatever happened. But check your equipment first, to keep egg from being on your face, you know. I actually, back when I was doing South Carolina, I may have told you the story about I went into a station and checked the EAS, and I found there was no audio on one of his monitor inputs. Well, under our relationship with the FCC, doing these inspections, we can't do any work for the station because it's a conflict of interest, which, you know, is understandable. But I try, if I can, and I'm sure John does too, to help them get compliant, not doing it themselves, for ourselves, but show them what to do while we're there, because I'd love for them to be compliant when I leave the building. So I asked the engineer, I said, well, let's just look around in the back and see maybe a wire broke off or something. And what I found was the board operator had unplugged the power to the radio that was feeding the monitor and plugged in his cell phone charger. So that's why he didn't have any audio. Do you have a question back there?
Two questions. When it says all streams, does that include internet radio? I mean, if you're feeding to an app or something like that, does EAS need to be on the online stream as well?
no, there's no requirement for that, but why not? I mean,
Right.
because, you know, the majority, I mean, most of the stations I work with, that stream's coming out of the console in most cases. Some it's not, but most of your listeners on the stream are locally, and so I would say it would just be a good idea.
Yeah.
But there's no requirement to it.
Depends on where you have the EAS in
That's right.
in the program stream. So.
And then secondly, while we're there, I've asked for them to run an EAS just so that I can verify, but is that good practice to continue to ask them to run an EAS test?
That used to be something that
Commission
FCC
did, yeah.
You can request that if you don't see it on the log, especially if they're doing it manually. You want to make sure they know how to do it.
Yeah.
So
I request it unless the weather is bad.
Right.
So
yeah, sure.
Yeah, I think if you walk in and they're manually running their test and the unit is set up in manual mode, then I think you probably have a right to request that as long as it doesn't cause any interruption in their programming. If they're in an automatic mode and you see that all the tests are running, I'd probably let it slide, because, I mean, most stations I walk into these days, there's never anybody there. I mean, really, never
Yeah.
anybody there. Maybe a morning show and that's it. And I haven't met most morning shows of late that could even push the buttons on the board, worse less find where the EAS box is.
They can hardly pour coffee.
That's exactly right. So I think you have to use your own good judgment on that. But if you look at their EAS and everything is in good order and it's obvious they're doing the job, I probably would not say run one, because I know that they're doing what they need to be doing. So you have to use your own judgment.
That brings up another point, is that you're supposed to install your equipment so that it will put it in the chain, audio chain, so that if a alert comes in, it will automatically interrupt it. Now, I did go to a station one time that actually had manual operators 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They had the EAS brought up on the console as an input. I questioned that. They said, well, if it does come in, we can pot it up. I still don't know that was, they said, well, we're here all the time. So I said, well, what if he's gone to the restroom or something when the alert comes in? So,
Yeah.
Okay, this may be a kind of far afield, and this may actually get us into the weeds, I don't know. But I've asked this question a long time ago on like the SBE EAS roundtable, and I really didn't get a real good solid answer on this. I'm from a TV background, but you hear it both ways. Should program audio duck all the way down? Yes.
Yeah.
I
Yes.
think so, but yet it doesn't seem.
Yeah, I don't,
It's not clear in the rules, and you hear it all the time. You know, you hear the alert come through, and you also hear program audio.
well, see, these boxes will not duck. They're either
Yeah.
on or off.
Well,
Yeah.
They could,
internally, but like when you're dealing with TV, that audio is going through the switcher card, and the switcher card is what determines whether
Right.
it ducks or not. So, I mean, especially with TV, you get that quite a bit.
I've
Interesting.
never,
I haven't run into that. I at least know I try to monitor a lot of the stations, and most of the EAS I've never run into that problem. I'm certain that there's probably cases, but you would want the audio to duct completely, because especially if you're an LP1 or 2 and somebody down the line is monitoring you, that could cause problems with the decoding.
oh, yeah, yeah.
So
So you receive weekly tests from all three sources, including IPAWS, transmit your own, and then you're also required to receive and relay the required monthly tests on all stations, secondary audio and video streams, and that has to be relayed within a 60-minute window. This used to be, when it first came out, it was set for 15 minutes. And we tried to run ours here in Alabama at like 17 after the hour, so that it would hopefully fall within the break, a television break at the bottom of the hour, but that never worked very well. So the SBE and the National Association of Broadcasters petitioned the commission to open that window up. So that window now is open. So once you receive a required weekly test, most people just do it automatic, just leave it automatic, and you get it and it turns right around and sends it out. But you can hold it off. Some TV stations will hold it off and then run it manually as long as it's run within that 60-minute window. Both the units have time relay settings in there that you can say, hold this off for 15 minutes, so to give the operator time to actually run it. If he doesn't run it within that window, it'll automatically run it. So that's the way that's set up. But you are required to receive that and relay that test. That actually has audio with it. There's actually a announcement with that. Of course, the fourth thing is you must receive and relay a National Emergency Alert Notification, an EAN, on all stations. The regular tests and all, and regular EAS, the buffer inside of these units is only 2 minutes. So information concerning any kind of EAS test or alert is limited to 2 minutes, with the exception of the president. You can't tell the president shut up after 2 minutes. He's got the floor. He can stay on. So the box is smart enough to know that it's an EAN, and it will actually, it won't use that buffer. It'll actually go any longer. And this is probably the most important, is you need to record the information about all the required EAS operations, and that's really all that was required. The test and the EAN. Weather is not required, amber is not required. That's the only thing that the FCC says is really required, which is a little strange that you would think weather would be required, but it's not. But you need to make sure you put that in the station log. This station log must be reviewed and certified weekly by the chief operator, the station's chief operator, and you have to keep them for 2 years. John has actually a copy of a log. This is one that we actually made up for stations in our area, and John uses it over there as well. You can log these things any number of ways. You can actually print the log if you wish, out of the Sage or out of the DASDEC, and review it weekly and sign off on it that you reviewed it. We came up with this because it allows you to keep a whole month's worth on one piece of paper. And being that it's in PDF, you can actually keep it electronically by cutting and pasting. What it actually does is the top section up there has to do with the monthly test. Who you received it from, the date and time you received it from, and then when you transmitted the required monthly test back out. Like I said, typically that's done automatically. The next section down here has to do with required weekly tests, And if you notice, this is actually one they did here or in South Carolina. So he's got more than required up there. But here's the IPAWS, which that's required. And then your monitor sources, if you're doing, his source number 1 is WCOS. I was reading the wrong thing.
Yeah.
WCOS is one source, and WTCB is the second source, and then IPAWS is the third.
Our LP1, LP2, and then IPAWS.
Yeah. And what you can do is you can look at your SAGE log or your DASDEC log and just move the date and time of that information over to that. What's really neat about this is you can see at a glance by just looking at that you either did or you didn't get, as you were talking about, a weekly test from each one of these sources. If you see that maybe on WCOS you missed 2 weeks in a row, well, that would be time to start looking to see what the problem is and find out what to do about it to get it corrected. This next area down here is where you actually put your own transmitted test, the date and time that you ran your own test. Again, you can see at a glance if you missed one. And then a place here to actually put some notes about the failure. We added this line a while back here since tower light malfunctions is part of the station log. Now, some stations, especially television stations, quite often keep their tower light monitoring on a separate log, maybe with their transmitter log, and that's okay, but you got to remember that is part of the station log, so that has to be reviewed weekly as well. So you can actually put that information here. We talked about earlier this morning that you don't have to put a notation in there of when you checked them. You just have to put information concerning any malfunction that you might have and how you addressed it. Did you call the FAA and get a note on issued and you put all that up in there. Then the most important thing is for the chief operator, a place for him to sign and date. And you cannot use initials down here. The commission will not accept initials. It's got to have the full name. And that used to be the same thing on logs. The commission used to get really antsy about that. And they said the only way you could use initials is if on one of the pages you had done a full signature and referenced the initial, but they want to see the whole thing. But this is a typical station log here where you can keep all information for a whole month on there. And this is something that's really important when you go in as an inspector. That's what you'll ask to see. Say, I want to see your station log. And you make sure that they kept it for 2 years. Typically, I'll just look at several and see that they are getting stuff from the different sources. If I see they're not getting anything from this particular source here, then that's a red flag. You need to go back and find out why they're not getting it. Yeah.
Going back to the public file with this, do you have a place in the public file where you keep a designated chief operator?
No, the designated chief operator, there's nothing wrong with that being in the additional documents part, but typically the designated chief operator letter or agreement is posted with the station licenses. So if you have a license book or you have it posted on the wall with the other station licenses, that's where you would want that. And you'd also want a copy of it with the licenses at the transmitter site.
By rule, it's readily available.
Yes.
And remember that designation has to have 2 people on it. It has to put the chief operator is,
Yeah.
and his alternative is.
Yes.
Put that down there. Somebody else have a question? I'll go.
Going
Yeah.
back to that, and this might be a sidebar question, but where it says chief operator or designee or appointee or however that was worded,
Yeah.
what provision allows for that? Because we run into situations a lot where there's those 3 things: the TV, certain directional things, class 1A, AM. Where as contractors, there's conjecture if we're allowed to serve as the chief operator, so their general counsel serves as the chief operator. However, we are providing attestation that all the parameters are correct. Designee, I'm always curious, that's the first time I've actually ever seen it. It might be I'm jumping on something.
Right here.
But
Yeah.
That would be the alternative.
Yeah.
The reason they ask for that is if you're on vacation, if you're the chief operator and you're on vacation, or maybe you're sick or whatever, and not there, when you're supposed to check it, then the designee, which would be the alternative, or somebody that you selected.
Could the designee be the ongoing person that's doing these, and then as long as they're reviewed by the chief operator at some point, or made available for review, or maybe that's a legal counsel question?
Well, it's probably more of a legal counsel question, but at the same time, you have a designated chief operator. That chief operator does have the ability that if I wanted to, say Larry's going to check my logs every week for me.
He has access to that.
Yeah, and then Larry would sign that, and then it's my responsibility as chief operator is to oversee that, but he's actually going through, because there are a lot of situations where I walk into, and Larry's probably had the same thing, that you see this more in television, that maybe one person, because there are like a couple TV stations at the operation, he's responsible for the EAS and that day-to-day operation, logging, tower lights and that kind of thing, and then somebody else is dealing with another aspect, and then there is a director of engineering for that two-station group that's overseeing everything. So
There's
So the
no,
precedent is there.
there's no reason there can't be more than two alternatives.
no, oh no,
So just as long as they're on the paper list,
Yeah.
whoever you think is gonna sign it,
yeah.
as long as they're on the alternative, chief operator, alternative.
Yeah, that's
And
not a,
whoever you might have signed it, have them on the paper.
I mean, there's a lot of cases where the chief operator may be the manager of the station.
Yeah, it
you
doesn't
know.
have to be an engineer,
Yeah.
and as a matter of fact, one of the FCC inspectors that used to be in this area, Angelo Diddy,
Yeah.
some of you may know, told me one day, he said, I'd suggest that the chief operator not be the engineer.
Yeah.
Not saying that the engineer would cover up problems, but it would be better to have maybe the operational guy or somebody to, because all he's doing is reviewing the log.
Right.
He or she is reviewing the log, not doing any technical work, just making sure the required entries are being made. If there's something missing, then that needs to be turned over to engineering to find out what the problem is, so.
But I guess our question is, this is an ongoing question, we have 73.1870 specifies that it has to be a hired, it has to be, it spells out employee. Except, and that goes back to that's our concern.
Yeah, that goes back to, various power levels having certain positions and that kind of
Oh,
thing.
yeah.
We run
And-
into that in our business. all
Yeah,
the time.
and I don't know, that would have to be a legal counsel question, because, I mean, I can say that I'm a chief operator and do contract engineering for a couple of stations, but I'm not an employee of the
As
station.
long as you're a contractor.
Yeah. You're technically hired by the station to do the work, but, there's that
But there
gray
is a
area.
rule.
Yeah, there is a
What
rule.
he's talking about,
Yeah.
if it's above a certain power
Yeah.
level, then you have to be a full-time employee.
Yeah.
One of our main clients, WSMA, their general counsel serves as the chief operator.
Yeah,
We
and-
provide attestation, but even Wiley Ryan has been like, are those or does that general counsel need to come down and learn,
Well, I think you just have to go by general counsel on that. I'm not sure, and I can't speak for the commission, but I'm not certain that they would even look at that aspect of it. If they walk in and you're the chief operator and everything's in good order and they don't find any problems,
I'm gonna nitpick it.
they're never going to go there. But I guarantee if they walk in and they start finding problem after problem, they're going to dig deeper. But I don't think
Yeah.
either one of
That
us can
doesn't-
answer
No.
that question. Yeah,
I need to go after every other station contract,
Precisely.
yeah,
Yeah.
Well, you got to remember, as a side note, and most of you already know this, that anything that the commission finds, no pun intended, but they might fine you with it, but anything that they discover and issue NALs or something doesn't actually go to the chief operator or the
goes to the
engineer.
owner.
It goes to the owner
yeah.
of the station. And obviously, if it's a technical issue, you'll probably be in the corner office the next day, explaining why that problem was, because managers and owners don't like to get bills from the commission for $10,000 or $20,000.
I mean, whether you're an employee of the station or you're a contractor of the station, whether you're the chief engineer or the chief operator, and you find technical deficiencies in the station, it's your responsibility to notify the owner and let them know. For two reasons. One, you're letting them know and you're doing your due diligence. Two, you're also covering your ass. Simple and
Precisely.
plain as that, because I know stations that I've done work for, and they have numerous deficiencies that they should be corrected, and from time to time I resend the email and I keep copies of it in my records, because there's only so much any of us can do depending on the owner of the station. You know.
Thank you for entertaining that. I know that was, I didn't mean to, that's just, I very much appreciate that.
We'll charge you later, don't worry.
All right, switch back over to
Okay.
that. A couple of other issues about the station log to be, you've got to have all the information required for the EAS operations. You have to have all the information concerning malfunction of the tower lights, and then information concerning transmission system failures or repairs. Now, this is one of those little gray areas, and John and I have talked about this before. Just if you drop off the air and come back on the air, obviously you don't have to put that in there, but if you're doing any calibration or work on the transmitter that's off the air for a period of time, then that's normally what goes in there. I don't see a lot of that. I don't know if you do, John, that people do that on the station log.
I don't. I mean, again, I would note it in the log if it's for more than just a couple of minutes, because we all get power bumps, lightning hits, and stuff like that. But you'd have to note it in two places. You'd have to note it in the station log, and then again in the maintenance log at your transmitter site. So
They sort of tie together that way, the
Yeah.
stuff you put in the maintenance log, but that's the same thing.
Well, I know our system on our station log, our system is set up to automatically poll the remote controls at all of our sites every 3 hours. And if it happens that one of those times it's polling, transmitter's off, power's out or something, it will record that. And if it's on the station log, then I will make a note, off air due to power outage at such and such time. And, you know, but yeah, just a minor power bump.
no,
Yeah.
no.
Any other questions about EAS before we move ahead? It's that and issues in public folder and the public file are
Yeah.
two big areas.
Yep, trust me, it's a cash register when it comes to EAS. EAS tower lights, programs, public file, issues programs,
That's
and then we'll talk more about it later, but fence locks and gates.
right. So just remember that. Something I was going to say and it just slipped my mind. That's when you get old, that happens. It'll come to me after a while, I guess. But so if there's no other questions about EAS, we'll just start talking. When you go to a transmitter site, and this is what we're going to do tomorrow, we're going to go to some transmitter site. Nowadays, with the online public file, about the only thing that you look at the studio, technically, is EAS to make sure that it's operating correctly. Well, then when you go to the transmitter site, there's a number of different things that you look at. The tower site inspection, and you want to look at the tower light and make sure that the painting is correct and the lighting is correct. These charts are available. I can give you all a link to these to see these, but it tells you the different heights and how the banding is supposed to be. Typically anything below or above 200 feet has to be painted and or lighted. Anything under 200 feet you don't necessarily have to paint it. We did run into some situations where people had painted towers below 200 and the banding was not correct, and I contacted the FAA to find out about that because the manager sort of got irritated with me when I told him. I said, the painting is not right on your tower. He said, but I'm under 200 feet. I don't have to paint it. This is just some old tower we put up. I said, yeah, but I think there is a requirement. And so I contacted the FAA. They said, well, under 200 feet, you're not required to paint it. If you decide to paint your tower, you can paint it green or purple or blue, whatever color you want to. But if you decide to use aviation orange and white, you have to conform to the banding. So what you'll see is up to 700 feet or 350 feet is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and that goes all the way up to 700 feet. So if you got a tower from 200 feet up to 700 feet, it has to have 7 bands of alternating paint, starting with orange on the bottom, or aviation arms on the bottom, and the top has to be the same color.
If I remember right, none of the bands can be over 100 feet, correct?
Uh,
Like if you've got an orange band and then a white band, they can't be more than 100 feet.
oh, I think that's right.
That,
Yeah, I
yeah.
believe that's right.
Yeah.
Because once you get above 700 feet, then you have more than 7 bands.
That's correct.
Yeah, yeah. Once you go over 700 feet, then you go to 9 bands, and then once you get over 1,100 feet, it goes to 11 bands. Matter of fact, we have a radio station I'm from Prattville, Alabama, down right next to Montgomery, and there's a 3-tower directional that's been off the air for 2 years because the guy just decided he didn't like radio and left country. But he's on 1410, which I think his towers are like 170 something feet at 1410. And I drove out there, was going down that road. My wife and I were driving down there, and I almost run out in the ditch because I looked over there and somebody had painted the towers. And remember, they're 176 feet, and it had 11 bands of paint. and some of them were like this, some of them were a whole 20-foot section, but some like that. And I called the guy that used to do engineering for him. I said, "Who painted that tower?" He said, "The manager did." And he said he thought it just looked nice that way. And I said, I said, you know, somebody flying by on an airplane is going to think it's a 1,100-foot tower, but you have to do that. Lighting is the same requirement, and you can look on the license, as John said this morning. It will tell you what type of lighting it's supposed to have. Anything up to 350 feet has to have 1 flashing beacon. Anything over 350 feet up to 700 has to have 2 levels. And the new, well, it's not a new ruling, it's been in effect pretty good while. You can't just have 1 flashing light in the mid part of the tower. You got to have 1 on each side. Reasoning being is that a pilot, when they're flying, depending on which angle they're coming at the tower, that if you just had 1, it may be on the back side of the tower and he won't see it. So they require you to put them on 2 legs so that you can see it from any direction. So from 350 to 700, you got to have 2 levels of blinking lights. 700 to 1,050, you got to have 3 levels. Up to 1,400 feet, then you got to go with 4 levels, and it keeps going up like this. Those lights actually have, if it's just incandescent beacons, it's got two 600-watt lamps in it. And theoretically, you're actually supposed to report if one of those bulbs goes out. The reason being is the amount of luminance that's coming out from that fixture is no longer, doesn't meet the standard. What is that word? Candle, I forgot what that word is.
Well, it's the candle power.
Candle power,
lumens,
yeah.
candle power.
That's why they got 2 600-foot,
Yeah.
600-watt beacons in there. Somebody had a question?
On the, if you got an older tower where they just put a single mid-level beacon in, is that grandfathered in
That's grandfathered. But
until
if,
they make any changes to the lighting system?
until you change anything on the tower.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, and that's a really fine area. That means if you just contacted the FAA about some instance in your tower, they could easily reissue and you'd have to change it all. Yeah.
You'd have to add another. That's the way. These are incandescent bulbs, and you can paint them. If you decide, you don't have to paint a tower, but if you don't paint a tower, then you got to put strobes on it, and that's what a lot of some people do that, and they think they're really saving a lot of money and not have to paint, but they don't realize that.
Yeah.
Strobe lights are really expensive.
The strobe companies really appreciate your support.
You can get any type of rigger, tower rigger, that can go up and change a light bulb.
Right.
I mean, you have to be careful when you hire somebody, and that's a whole nother story. Make sure they're insured and bonded, and when the tower guy comes out and he's got one of his bags, he's got lamp bulbs in it, and the other side he's got a 6-pack, you probably don't want to use him very much. But I actually saw that one time, the reason I said that. But you can't get a regular rigger. A regular tower rigger can't work on a strobe light. That takes a technical person to go up, because there's a whole bunch of electronics in those flashers, and that's what Frank was nodding his head about $8,000, you know. to
Technically,
work on
they're
that.
supposed to be certified, and all the components that you use must be FAA approved. That's the technical reading of the law. And there are companies out there that have components that are certified, and there are those that don't, and they argue back and forth all the time. I have no dog in that hunt and won't tell you which way to go. But the strobe is a lot more critical dealing with that on a day-to-day basis and maintenance and replacement parts and everything than any bulb or any LED ever could. So,
Well, we've gone to LED strobes on some.
Yeah.
It seems to be kind of a happy medium.
yeah, because finding crews that can climb the towers, especially the taller towers, and that understand the work and that are certified by the various companies and or the FAA are harder and harder to find. And now with repack going on, they're not interested in tower lights. They want to put up the next antenna. So that makes it even tougher. So.
It really is. But that's the first thing when you get, one of the main things you look at when you go to the tower site on the inspection is to look at the tower, look at the lighting, make sure the lighting is working, make sure the lighting system is working, and they have a way to monitor it. I always ask the engineer, I said, how do you monitor your tower lights? Does Farmer Joe across the street watch them for you and fill out a form, or do you check them visually yourself, or do you have a remote control, or do you have an automatic system? And I asked them to show me that so I can see what they've got. And you see all kind of homemade rigs where they're monitoring the tower light, but you have to have some way to monitor those lights. This would be high intensity strobes, and they follow pretty much the same as the other. Up to 700 feet, you can have one blinking on the top with two side lamps, and then the same thing up to 1,000 feet, 3 levels, and up to 1,400 feet, 4 levels, and so on like that. But those are the high intensity strobes. Now they have to run day and night because you're not painting the tower. That's the whole deal. Some people want to go strobes because they say, well, that will keep me from having to paint my tower. Well, yeah, but the cost involved in strobes long way go the other way as far as painting. Plus, one reason you paint the tower is to keep it from rusting. So you may still have to paint the tower to keep it from rusting. Speaking of the paint, let's look at that. We actually have a chip chart. John and I both have a chip chart that is approved by the FAA. And sometimes you can look at a tower and know that without even using the chip chart, but we can put this up against the tower leg and see if it falls within the reflectivity, they call it, I think, of the paint, that it falls into the right. These are really a special paint. It's got a special number with it, and you have to use aviation orange and aviation white. You can't have a tower crew that goes down and buys white and red paint and pours some of the white in there and stirs it up to make it look orange. You know, you gotta have that special thing.
I think it's a Sherwin-Williams, I think it is.
I think it's Sherwin-Williams.
Yeah, Sherwin-Williams, and it is a special paint.
A humorous story that's floating around, which I'm sure all of you have probably heard from time to time, and the inspector that did this swears that it was actually true. He was coming through a town. He had been doing some inspections, and he was coming back through this little town, and he saw this tower out at a little AM station, and it was really awful. I mean, it was faded really bad. It was sort of a pink color. It had faded so bad and was chipping off. So he said, well, I'm just going to stop by, you know, I'm not inspecting them. And went in, and there was this little old man and a little old lady in there that ran it. And he introduced himself. He said, I'm not here on an official visit, but I just thought, I noticed your tower, and just wanted to remind you that you're probably going to have to paint that because it's really out of effect. And the lady interrupted him and said, yeah, we know about that. Said, me and Paul were talking about that the other day, that we were going to have to repaint this tower because it was chipping off and everything. He said, okay, I appreciate y'all looking into it, and I just wanted to let you know about it, and y'all have a nice day and make sure you get it painted. She said, we will. So he left. And a few months later, he came back through town, and the tower was the same color. It was terrible looking paint. And he goes in, and when he walks in the door, Eric Rice is the one that told this
Yeah.
story. When he walked in the door, and the first thing the lady said, even before he introduced her, she said, "Hey, glad to see you back by. How you like our tower? We painted it about a week after you were here. Isn't it nice?" He said, "But it's the wrong color." She said, "No, it's not. It can't be, because I went out and got a chip of paint off of it and took it down to the paint store, and they matched it perfectly." So make sure that your tower guy gets the right paint and not water it down. I've seen
Yeah.
some non-scrupulous tower crew, they're running low on paint. They'll try to thin it down to make it.
Do not let anybody paint your tower if you're dealing with it, and warn your clients that you're inspecting and not be at the site the whole time. Because I've seen cases where they'll paint the first 100 feet or so and leave the rest of it. Or only paint the outer of the legs and leave everything inside unpainted.
Yeah.
That's where drone inspections can come in. real
Yes,
handy.
very true.
Frank's buddy, Bob Newberry, told me this. We went out to inspect at iHeart Station, and we went out there, and I said, "Bob, what's wrong with your tower paint? It's awful." He said, "Back up a little bit and look at the other higher up." And it was fine. I said, "What in the world happened to your tower?" And he may have told you the story, Frank. He said, "I'm embarrassed to tell you, but this guy came into town and he said, 'I'm a tower painter and wanted to know if you had any towers needed painting.' Said, 'I've got some time.' And Bob says, 'As a matter of fact, I do. I've got this one over here that needs painted.' So the guy said, 'Okay, I'll be out there first thing in the morning and I'll get started on it.' Well, he got out there and Bob left or something, and when he came back, the guy was spray painting the tower. He had this long hose coming out of the back of his truck, spray painting the tower, and he was getting more on the trees and the roof of the building than he was on the tower, and he was painting it from the bottom up, which made no sense. So he told him, "No thank you, just stop where you are. I'll get somebody else to finish it up." So like you said, don't leave the tower site while somebody's out there.
Just a quick question. I got one of those chip charts a number of years ago. It was hail chart.
Right.
Yes.
And when I looked back into it, they'd gone out of business. Where can you get one?
Oh, what's the name of that company?
GME Supply has.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it.
GME, yeah.
And one thing about it, when you get your chip chart, if you keep it in a folder that is like on a shelf somewhere that stays dark all the time, because they will fade, so
They
you
will.
have to take very good care of them.
No, don't leave them laying out in the sun.
No, not at all.
They'll fade, but.
Yeah.
But like I say, some towers you see, you can just look at it and you know, no, I wouldn't have to use a chip chart on that one.
Yeah.
Obviously, yeah. In addition to meeting paintings, look at the top.
That's a
Yeah.
mechanical beam tilt.
So the violation would be, as an inspector, is the painting is not right on the tower. The fact that the tower's fixing to fall down is not a violation of the inspection. I mean, that's a plumb intention problem, which is not listed on the self-inspection list, I don't think.
That's rust, I'd worry about it anyway.
That's
Yeah.
right, Lennon.
That's holding up the tower.
The rust, yeah. When you drive up to the tower, before you go in the building, look up at the tower and see on an FM. Look and see how many bays it's got on it, and compare that, as John was talking about this morning, compare that with the station license to make sure. I've been to a couple of stations where one I went to that the license showed a 2-bay, there was a 4-bay up there, and I asked the guy about it. I said, "Did you change antennas lately?" "No." He said, "Oh yeah, we did. About 4 years ago, we put up a new antenna." I said, "You took the 2 down and put a 4? "Yeah." I said, "But you never filed anything with the commission." "Oh, I didn't know we were supposed to do that." So he was running a 4-bay antenna, which has a lot more gain than a 2-bay, and so he was running over power. His ERP was a lot more. So always look up there and count the number of bays to make sure that it matches, and that would be a cause of not approving their certification of compliance, because it doesn't compare with the license. I just did one recently that John and I were talking about, where the license showed a 2-bay half-wave spaced antenna with X amount of TPO out of the transmitter. When I got there, there was a 4-bay antenna and the transmitter was running about twice the power than what was on the license. And the engineer said, well, the ERP is correct, because we mounted the antenna so the center of radiation on the 4-bay was at the same center of radiation as the 2-bay. And so I recalculated the power because of the gain, and that's what it set out to be. And I calculated it myself, and that was right. But the problem is, they never filed with the commission. The commission's license, and you got to go by what's on that license, regardless of. Now, granted, he's operating legally as far as ERP, if he mounted it at center radiation and did his power calculations right. His ERP was correct, but it didn't comply with the license, and that's what you as an inspector have to go by.
Again, if he would have done that and there was no interpretation or no notification on the license of TPO and antenna, then he could have kind of been legal because you wouldn't have known otherwise, even though you're supposed to file. But if it had another licensed antenna and TPO on there, you would obviously know it. So
you mentioned, I think we talked last night, this morning, there has been some cases where on some licenses it will say antenna type and TPO as necessary to achieve licensed ERP.
right.
Well, what does that tell you? I mean, with no documentation, how do you know?
Well, remember there is the form 301 and 302 that you file for your license and then the actual 301 where you put all the technical data on. You really, in those cases, you want to see a copy of that somewhere. I still hang on to those because there it's broken down by length of line, gain of antenna, and what's needed to achieve the correct ERP from the transmitter. A lot of consulting firms now will actually put a separate exhibit in that will have that information, and that's really handy because then you can pull that single exhibit out and put it as part of your license book and there's never any question. So you can look for stuff like that. Another thing that might help you before you go to a site, you can look ahead of time and look under applications, and you might see form 301, 302. Go through those and look at all the documents and details. They tell you a world of information there, including what the antenna is. One other thing that's a little off subject, but if you inspect a translator, a lot of these AMs have co-owned translators and you might be requested to inspect it. Translator antennas are supposed to be the same antenna that was specified in the application for construction permit. And whatever the commission grants, if they grant Shively 6812 or an SWR FM1, that is the antenna that is supposed to be on that tower and what the FCC licensed. A lot of times the station, for whatever reason, may change the antenna and tell the commission otherwise, and you get out there and find out it's entirely different. It might be 2 days instead of 1 bay, or it may be 1 bay instead of 3 bays. And on translators, the number of bays are critical in the performance of the antenna in relationship to interference to other radio stations. So that's where doing a little research ahead of time and looking at the license and then looking at the antenna when you get there can help you out a lot on these.
You really have to be careful on translators and LPFMs, although that's not typically falls under the present ABIP contract. You'll often be asked to look at those things and check them out, and LPFMs especially, not being ugly to people that get LPFMs, but they don't, most of them don't have a clue of what they're doing. I had one guy call me with a radio station and said a church had applied for an LPFM, and this guy came over to the station and said, do you have room on your tower up on the hill that I can put my antenna on? He said, yeah. He said, but do you have a construction permit? Yeah. Well, where does it say your antenna is supposed to be? Oh, it says it's supposed to be down on the top of our church. But we're down in a hole and we're not going to get out good. We'll get out much better if we're up on the hill on your tower. So sometimes you sort of have to watch out to.
Yeah, Commission just finished finding an LPFM in Florida. It was quite funny because I was distantly involved. I got a call one day from a bishop somebody, I don't know what his name was. It was a very unusual last name. And it was urgent that he got an antenna ordered that day and shipped overnight. Well, that's a little hard to do because most antennas are specific to frequency unless they're buying a broadband or something on that order. And then he called me back about 2 days later and said, okay, I need to order this thing right away. I'll call you back and give you a credit card number. Well, I never heard anymore, and the next thing I know, there's a notice of an LPFM that had been fined, had gotten a notice of violation by the commission out of the Atlanta office because their LPFM transmitter site, it was either 6 or 10 miles from the location it was supposed to be and operating at 1,000 watts instead of 100 watts. That was the good bishop. So you occasionally you run into those.
Oh, that's just another shot. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you can look to make sure they've got the right number.
Yeah, C250 kilowatts.
Huh?
C250 kilowatts.
Yeah,
6
that's
days.
right. There's, we were talking about earlier today about the RF warning signs. This one indicates, this is a yellow one. It says, beyond this point, radio frequency fields of this site may exceed FCC rules for human exposure. If the amount of RF energy in that area is above a certain area level, then you actually go to a red one, I think, that says warning, RF levels in this compound actually exceed.
Got a blue one for above minimum public exposure. And then it's the red one for above that's allowed for trained personnel.
That's right,
Yeah.
yeah. A lot of times you'll see those when they have, if you go and inspect a station, you don't see this much anymore, especially down the south, but if you have high-rise buildings and there's an antenna up on top of this building, there's a little short tower, there's a lot of RF up there. I know in New York at 4 Times Square, John Lyons, who was the project manager of that site, he was telling me that it is so hot up there with RF that people that go up there have to go through training. And like the air-conditioned people that have to go up there can only stay out on that roof for 15 minutes.
He didn't tell me that the day we were up there.
Is that what happened to you?
That's what happened. They actually have designated areas both on 4 Times Square. They have designated areas up there where people can be and can't be as far as maintenance people go. And that site, of course, is an aux site to Empire State. So it's a backup site, except for one station now that's operating, or 2 stations that's operating full time there.
I don't know how I missed this in all these years. So you say yellow ones are may exceed and the red are does exceed? Was that the delineation?
Yeah. Well, or orange. There's an orange out there as well.
Yeah,
too. This is what you're going to see on most fences around the AEMs, because the fences typically are going to be far enough away, and Larry's got a slide that, or I think, shows the distances.
And
that's typically what you see. And this also works really good to put on the back door of your storage building. The neighbors stay away. They really do. So.
I actually saw a, let me see what this is here. There will actually be, around some sites, you may have RF hotspots.
Yeah.
And unless you go out, and you actually have to certify that when you're filing with the commission about the RF level, if you've got any hotspots, we actually had one on our 1,200-foot tower that, oddly enough, the hotspot was right at the gate out on the road where you came in. For some reason, there was a lot of RF right there at that gate. But most people don't have the test equipment, to read all that, but that's something that you need to do. And so once you do that, you can tell if the RF where people are going to be exceed a certain level, then the colors of these, this just says may exceed, there may be some RF in there, but as you go up to red, and you're talking about the blues and the other, that's different levels.
I've seen, I think it's like notice, caution, then warning.
Yeah.
That's right, caution's in between.
Yeah.
I think the caution is a green, is that?
No.
green?
No, it's the
Oh, that's- yeah,
yellow,
that's the
and that's
crossing.
the typical sign because most of the sites that you run into this are AM sites, and most stations have long since gone through all the calculations and determinations, and they have their fences. And actually, it's much closer. Where's your chart? Well, we'll get to
Yeah,
that
I've
in a minute.
got
It's
the
much
chart.
closer to the tower than you would think
I've
it
seen
would
something
be.
like if you've got a gate out at the road, it'll have a warning sign on it.
Yes.
Caution signs will be on the fences surrounding the tower.
Yeah.
Right.
And
right.
now that you mentioned gates on road, this is something, Larry, you and I didn't mention earlier with, you want to be sure that the gate at the road has the duplicate signs
Right.
with tower registration, everything that you have at the station, because the commission is not going to cross that gate if it's locked. So whether that road is 3 miles from the site or 300 feet from the site, if they can't readily read the number visibly from the gate that's locked, then you're in violation.
I
Yes.
heard the phrase publicly accessible point.
Yeah.
And you
Yeah,
gotta put it
that's
on a
right.
stick.
Yeah.
Right.
You know, if it's a private house or something like that, publicly accessible point.
Right.
First one, closest to
Yep.
Like
That's
you turn
exactly
off
right.
a road or something.
Yep.
I did an inspection up in South Carolina one time where you had to go through 3 gates. It was up there on Cedars.
Hogback or
Huh? I think
Hogback
it-
or Caesars.
Was it, I think it was Cedar, but it went across some federal land, some sort of federal thing. But there was like 3 gates you
Oh,
had
that's
to go through.
Hogback. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they had it on there, on each one of them.
Are you required to have an ASRN sign on the tower, or can it be on the building adjacent to the tower?
The ASR,
Yes.
I think it can be on
On
the
the
either
building.
one.
Yeah, it could be on the either one. It could
I've
be at
seen
the
it on
gate.
either.
Yeah. A lot of people just put them on the tower just because it's easy to do that, and that's nothing wrong with that. Or they put it on the building adjacent to the tower.
Okay.
So
One thing you don't want to do, I caution people, don't make an ASR sign that has your station logo on it.
yeah,
Because
Target.
kids seem to think that looks good in their room. You
Yeah.
know, they'll steal it and take it.
Unless if you run a talk station.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.